All right, guys, good morning. Welcome back to another rousing round of biomechanics. We're just going to start up where we left off last time. I've got it set up so I can see the chat, and otherwise, I'll probably have to flip that over since I'm about to share the screen. As always, if you guys have questions, please feel free to go ahead and just drop them in the chat anytime you want, and be more than happy to clear up anything you guys might have any questions about. So we left off talking about why you should study biomechanics. And it turns out there's a variety of different ways that we're going to be able to apply the knowledge that you gain in this class, and trying to think about how effectively we can just use science to improve performance, decrease risk of injury, and hopefully in turn, increase enjoyment for whatever you're doing. So, one of the big factors we always need to keep in mind is what's known as anthropometrics. Okay? Anthropometrics are effectively size, shape, and weight of segments of the body. Now, if we have an idea of how much different areas of the body weigh, how big they are, we're going to start to get an idea of how much force is required to move it, how much torque is going to be being produced, and so on. So, for example, and this is going to be one of your guys' first labs, you can do this on your own, which we're going to look at your wingspan. And we're going to look at then obviously how tall you are, how long is your torso, how long are your legs, and all of these things are going to be factors in, once again, performance. So if we're trying to find, if I can give you an athlete that has really long arms and long legs relative to their height, what sport do you think they'd naturally have an advantage with?
Basketball.
Yeah, basketball. In fact, Anthony Davis is a great example of it in that, yes, he's, I think, 6'11", but his wingspan is like 7'4". That's why he can pretty much just reach up and touch the rim, because he's not only freakishly tall, but then he has even freakishly longer arms. And in reality, you usually see athletes like pitchers in baseball. They typically have relatively long arms, specifically long forearms relative to their height, because it gives them a greater amount of whip whenever they're throwing a baseball. Now, what sports do you think naturally having shorter arms are going to be an advantage? Sorry, that's the T-Rex pose, just so we're clear.
Powerlifting?
For bench press, yes, Zach, because it turns out if you just have to and be done, it's really easy to be strong. But when it comes to the deadlift, it works against you. But a sport where you're going to have a natural advantage with having shorter arms is actually going to be wrestling, because you're going to be able to produce more torque because you've got a shorter limb of which you're working with. So, yeah, I mean, if you're a bench only guy, you want to have T-Rex arms. But if you're a full power guy, that's a long way you got to pull a barbell when you're deadlifting. But that's the big key, is where you have an advantage in one way, you get a disadvantage in the other. So, for example, I have a wingspan that's about, I think it's like 6'4", 6'5", and on a really good day, I'm 5'10", aka really good day, which is not, okay, I'm really 5'9" now, I'm getting older and I'm shrinking. But this is great for me deadlifting, because it turns out I don't have to pull the bar as far. But when it comes to bench press, and especially military press, my God, I feel like the bar has to keep going and going and going before I ever lock it out. So, what I lose on the bench press or the overhead lift, like the log and strongman, I gain on the deadlift. And so that's the big key when you're working with your athletes, which is the way you're built gives you advantages and disadvantages. And how do you make it work given the sport? Now, don't get me wrong, sports like swimming, you want to have really long arms. You actually want to have a really long torso, and you want to have short legs, but really big feet. Kind of weird, but that's actually the best body type for swimmers. And if you want to be a gymnast, you just want to be more compact in general. You want to be a shorter, more compact frame. You don't see 5'10" gymnasts. They're usually obviously much shorter. It also has to do with the torque that you encounter and the forces you're going to produce and have to receive when you're jumping off. So we want to have a basic idea of how much each of these areas are going to contribute. Now, Another key component, which is going to be a bit different from what you guys need experience, is between a qualitative variable and a quantitative variable. We're going to spend a lot of time in this class looking at quantitative variables, meaning we're giving them numbers that are based in science. So this is going to be distance, and distance is always going to be in meters. We're using the metric units. Time in seconds. Acceleration is going to be meters per second, or sorry, velocity is going to be meters per second. Acceleration is meters per second squared. This is a change in acceleration, or a change in velocity. Good Lord, sorry about that, guys. And so we're going to look at weight in kilograms, and then force ends up being newtons, and we're going to move forward from there. Now, qualitative is more or less just kind of giving them a basic quality, which is a useful thing, specifically when you don't have a way to essentially ground things in numbers. But what you can gain by going through and looking at the data is going to give you an advantage over simply basing everything off of what you can see. Because the simple reality, guys, is part of, it might sound a little odd, but the training and the way that I want you guys to think about this class and specifically try to learn, which is, my goal for you is not to turn you guys into Dr. Google, and that, you know, you can Google this and then enter it. I'm not going to have you ever memorize a formula. I just want you guys to understand how to apply the formula, and what the information the formula is giving you is going to be useful or not useful. Okay? Calculators are way faster than any of us are ever going to be with long division and multiplication. But the calculator can't help us figure out how we can apply it to the athletes. Are any of you guys familiar with what is known as sabermetrics, or have maybe seen the movie or read the book Moneyball? Okay, that's okay, it's okay. The basic idea is the Oakland A's had a very small budget, and effectively a mathematician came, well, a statistician came to the general manager saying, I think if you recruit these type of baseball players, you'll actually be more successful. Because up until then, the scouts were the ones that did the recruiting. They're looking for these things like, oh, the guy's strong, he's fast, he's blah, blah, blah. And whereas this guy was simply taking a quantitative. Because the problem is we're all biased, okay? Everyone probably thinks they're above average, which I've obviously admitted the fact that I'm obviously not above average with height. But we have a tendency to put our own bias into things and be like, oh, I like that person, so I'm going to rate them higher. Or I don't like that person, I'm going to rate them lower. Whereas when you're just looking at the numbers, there's no emotion involved. It's just straight up, this is what it's showing you. And that's why in the late 90s, yeah, I believe that would be the time frame, or early 90s, the Oakland Athletics, with a budget, I think it was something insane, like only a third of what the New York Yankees was as far as for athlete salaries, were one of the best teams in baseball, because they were actually tracking the quantitative variables that matter. And if you can track the variables that matter and apply it, you're probably going to have an advantage. In fact, that's one of the things we're doing right now in the lab. And you guys, if you want to help out, you're more than welcome to, which is we're trying to figure out who's the better athlete to recruit for your football team, is specifically with linemen. Is it better to get, when we go back to anthropometrics, the dad bod, the guy that's 6'6" and 300 something pound and got to stick the gun out so you can kind of see it a little bit, like he's just a big guy with a lot of body fat, and then with time they're going to put muscle mass on and make him a better athlete? Or is it better to take a guy who's naturally, he's 6 foot something tall, but he hasn't filled out yet. He's still maybe only 230 pounds. So you're going to take that 3-4 years to put another 50 plus pounds on that frame. Who ends up being the better athlete? And because in theory, if you figure out really what is the best type of individual to recruit in D1, that's going to give you an advantage. And it turns out if you get an advantage, you tend to win. So how we can use quantitative variables to give us information that in turn is going to be predictive of success with athletes. Does that make sense to you guys? Thank you. Now, just a bad little joke, but I think it's kind of funny. And when you're coaching, it is really hard to be like, yeah, I need you to put effectively 10 more newtons of force laterally into the object in order to be successful. Like, I need you to push to your left a little bit harder. Like, we need to be able to coach qualitatively, but we want to try to quantify pretty much anything that we can to give us an advantage. So Turns out we don't have a way for you guys to talk to each other, so this kind of makes this slide null and void. But if you guys don't mind, you put up in the chat what you guys would think of for an example of what you would try to quantify in sport. Actually, let's have fun. What's really hard to quantify in sport? So like, it's easy to quantify free throw percentage. How many did you make? But what can you guys think of that's a pretty hard thing to quantify? Because there's a lot of things in sport that's hard to quantify. Hustle. Yes. And I think hustle could be an issue because, wow, you're running really fast to nowhere. So that can be a lot of wasted energy. Long jump steps, inches off of the board. Yeah, and timing that out to make sure your approach is correct. Good, Braden. Full effort. Ooh. Oh, thank you, Corey. Good old toughness. We do this drill because it builds mental toughness. You think with as much mental toughness is being built, like anyone that ever played a sport in high school would just be frickin' titanium and unbreakable. Like, it's safe to say, you're right. Those are absolutely hard things to measure. I mean, heck, look at the sport of football. If you're a running back, we can get a pretty good idea of how successful you are. But if you're an offensive lineman, can you guys think of any good statistic that you track to let you know how effective that lineman is? And even more so for any of you guys that have played, could be soccer, could be football, could be basketball. If you're a really good athlete, it turns out the other team might try to double team you, might try to make sure the ball never goes anywhere near you. So at the end of the game, your statistics would show that you had a bad game, but in reality, your team did better because they were wasting a lot of resources trying to stop you. So like one-on-one sports, if we're doing something like tennis, we're doing something like, well, even wrestling, that can be hard because you could be an incredible wrestler, but you just happen to be facing only the world's best. And you look like clown shoes, but in reality, you actually were pretty good. So just keep this in mind. We're going to quantify what we can, but understand there's always going to be flaws in the system. So we don't need to do any bonus, but you guys can look through that. Just kind of some examples of physics of weightlifting. That's, is that Cheryl Levick, I think? She was one of the U.S. Olympic lifters, heavyweight. And right there, ladies and gentlemen, for the guys here that like to think they're strong, she's got 100 and I think that right there is about 120 kilos. It might be 125 kilos that she's snatching overhead. So to give you guys an idea, that ends up being about 275 pounds that she jumped from the floor all the way to overhead in one movement. So if you needed a nice early, reference point of people that are actually strong, there you go for this morning. Any questions over anything that we've covered here that you guys would like me to go into with a little bit further in depth? Oh, and thank you. I think it was John and Zach for emailing me your groups. So those of you guys that are in the groups with them, I've got that information. Folks that are in the other groups, you still need to email me who all's in your group. So you guys ready to go deep into physics? Because this is where things are going to get real. Okay. So we're starting with the basics because that's a great place to start. Now we're effectively going to start off what could be really modified into a solid your mama joke, if you guys are familiar with those from back in the day, which is the difference between our body mass and our body weight. Mass is just how much matter makes up your body. Weight is how much you are going to be effectively having the force applied into the ground thanks to gravity. So whether you're on Earth, you're on the moon, you're on Mars, you're going to have the same mass. The key is the weight you feel is always going to be relative to the gravity. So if I have any Dragon Ball Z fans here, this would be the idea of getting to be in that kind of that hyper gravity chamber. I watched it back in the day, guys, but honestly, I was in high school. So the idea is if you could train in a room that had 2 times gravity, well, now your mass would be the same, but your weight would feel twice as much. So every time you did a push-up, you'd be pushing twice as much weight. Every time you did a squat, same thing. And so notice this is going to be proportional to force equals the gravitational constant multiplied by the mass of object 1 multiplied by the mass of object 2 divided by the distance from the center of those masses squared. Okay. This is just a fun little formula that pretty much shows you how the Earth can't be flat. But I mean, to be fair, they've only known that for a long time. But I guess if you look in the corners of YouTube, still some people are going to believe that, because remember that thing I said about bias earlier? There you go. Now, if you're looking at this formula, guys, if we wanted to be lighter, aka we wanted to feel a lower amount of force, would we want to be closer to the center of the Earth, or would we want to be further from the center of the Earth? You can throw that up in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Further.
Bingo, because notice it's over distance squared, absolutely. So hence why, as you go further and further, obviously into orbit, you're actually going to be feeling a smaller amount of force until eventually you're out of the gravitational pull, or at least, yeah, the tighter gravity well of the planet, and you'll be weightless. And then the same thing is true if we go the opposite direction, where if we go closer to the center of the Earth, we're actually going to feel a little bit heavier. Now, even from being on top of Mount Everest to being in the bottom of the Marianas Trench, you're not going to probably have that great of a difference in how you feel. But obviously, if you go a number of miles vertically away from the planet, you're going to feel a bit of a difference. So if you guys wanted to try to do an absolute nerdy burn of somebody's mom, you could literally figure out how much their mother would have to weigh in order for her to start to exert a gravitational pull on individuals around her. So I'm not going to dignify that today, but you know, that's an option. So here's that formula, once again, having everything out. Now, when you see the letter M, it's often going to mean mass, okay? When you see D or the letter X, that is going to be distance, okay? And then F, capital F, is going to stand for force, okay? We are not going to have this formula show up on any of your exams, but this is one of the underpinnings to realize that we're starting from, okay? Now, when we're looking at physics that effectively matter a lot more to us, the first one we have is going to be what's known as inertia, okay? Inertia is an object's natural resistance to any form of change, okay? So that means to either make something start moving that stopped, or to make something that's already moving move faster or move slower, okay? Now, inertia is going to be modified by things like our air resistance, gravity, friction, and then a force that's applied upon it. So, for example, all of you guys right now have inertia, okay? Every object has inertia. Now, if we're talking about something light like a pen, it turns out it's really easy for me to slide it across because it has such a small amount of mass, it doesn't have a lot of resistance to change. But then, when it comes to moving the desk, it turns out that has a little bit more resistance. And then if it turned out I decided to walk out of here and started trying to push the football players around for no reason, which would be really weird, especially during a pandemic when we shouldn't be touching each other, that would have even greater amounts of inertia. So how many of you guys have pushed a baby stroller or a cart or shopping cart or something like that recently? You guys got a pretty good idea, like it's not that hard to maneuver that. But if you have one of the wheels that doesn't work, you can feel how you have that extra resistance where it keeps pulling the other way because you've got a greater amount of friction. Now, if we think about the mass inside of it, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's ever done shopping cart jousting, which is a fun thing to do if you guys ever get a chance. You just put a friend in the shopping cart, one and the other, and you just run them at each other and then have them try to take each other out. It turns out that's going to require even more. And how many of you guys have ever had to experience the humbling, the humbling job of pushing a car for a certain amount of distance because it broke down on you? No? I'm the only one that's had to push a car more than once in his life? Yeah, it's a lot of fun, isn't it? How many of you guys ever had to push a truck? especially even if those things are in neutral. That's a lot of fun, isn't it? So same thing, more inertia, okay? And then we're going to get ourselves into what we're going to refer to as velocity. Velocity is effectively speed. The only key difference is instead of distance, we're talking about now displacement. Now the difference between distance and displacement is, let's say we're having you naturally like drive up a hill, okay? On your car, you have your speedometer, and that's how fast you went that straight line. Now, with velocity, you're gonna have, if you're going up a hill, you're gonna have both a horizontal velocity and a vertical velocity. That's the key difference between the two. That's what's known as vectors, and we're going to be incorporating these into projectiles and motion in general, okay? Then we have acceleration. Acceleration is our change in velocity. And just so we're clear, velocity is meters per second. Acceleration is meters per second squared. Now, when we think change in velocity, if you're driving, say, down the bypass, you're driving around campus, and something like comes out in front of you and you have to slam on your brakes, is the acceleration you're experiencing right there a positive or a negative acceleration? You can throw it up in the chat, or you guys can go ahead and unmute yourself. It's your choice.
Can you repeat it?
Yes. And actually, Haley, negative, great job. If you're driving along and you have to slam on your brakes to avoid hitting something, what type of acceleration do you experience? And so the answer there is that's negative acceleration. So if I'm walking along and I stop, I've just gone from a velocity of say like 1 meter per second to 0. So that means my change in velocity is going to be -1. Does that make sense? Now, same thing, if I'm at a dead stop and then I go forward, I have a positive acceleration because I've gone from 0 to whatever speed I'm going. And the greater the acceleration, both positive and negative, the greater forces you're gonna feel on your body, because force is going to simply equal mass times acceleration. So any of you guys had a chance to ride in a like a sports car or like something that has like a whole lot of horsepower and torque anytime recently, or gone on a roller coaster where you really feel that effect of that acceleration when you're coming up to speed and you're literally pulled back, not because anything's pushing you, but because of the weight of your own head and the weight of your body is being driven backwards by that acceleration. And so the amount of acceleration you're experiencing, multiply the mass of your body, is going to give you the force that you're now experiencing. And that's why they refer to, have you guys heard of like with fighter pilots and otherwise, like how many G forces that they pull? You guys heard of that before? It's going to be multiples of gravity. So hence you usually, I can't remember the number, I think it's something like 5+ G's is when you usually black out, because it's so much force your body's encountering that literally you can't push the blood to your brain hard enough. So fun's with science. Now, what we have here, guys, is looking at the force, velocity, and power profile of Usain Bolt's 9.58 100-meter. So if we're gonna, let's start in the upper left, and you can see literally his running speed, okay? Now the red is gonna be, the red line inside is the average, the blue is the actual momentary velocity. Why does this velocity go up and down, up and down, and up and down? Why isn't it in a smooth line?
Because he's taking steps.
Yes, that's pretty much the only way to walk, but absolutely. So when you're sprinting, when your foot's on the ground pushing, you're going faster. But then whenever you're in that flight phase, so both of your legs are off the ground, you're slowing down thanks to the actual wind acceleration. And then you're driving again. And that's why you have that natural faster, slower, faster, slower. Now, if you watch somebody, you don't actually see it. But when we look at it with really high resolution and obviously high speed cameras, now you start to be like, oh, okay, like that's a little bit different. And so then if we go across, you've got what's known as the speed time curve. And what we've got is effectively how much force he's putting into the ground horizontally over time. And it turns out as he gets to be going faster and faster, he's not able to put as much force in the ground because he's literally not on the ground as far or as for as long. And then we're looking at the bottom right, what we have is what's known as his peak power. Now power, we're gonna get to in a few moments, okay? First, you need work. Work is going to be the force that you've applied over the distance. Power is that force multiplied by the distance divided by time. So we can have done the exact same amount of work, but whoever did it in a shorter period of time is the more powerful one. And so he hits his peak power only about 1 second into the actual race, because that's where he's going slow enough still that he can apply enough force, and he's really accelerating his body at a high speed, and then it tapers off once he gets up to top speed where he's just trying to maintain. So acceleration for what we're going to be doing in this class is often going to be uniform acceleration. And that is the type of acceleration that we're getting from gravity, okay? In that it's going to give us the exact same acceleration the entire time we're doing something. So what we have on the right is going to be someone jumping from a high dive. And notice, guys, the amount of distance that you're going to fall after each second. And that we're going to keep accelerating until we hit what's known as terminal velocity. And so for a human being, oh boy, I can't remember what that is. Terminal velocity is going to depend on the position you're falling in, like whether you're kind of in the skydiver, like sprawled out position, or if you're in a dive position. But I think terminal velocity for humans, it's like 100 and something miles an hour, depending on positioning, obviously. Either way, it's really freaking fast. And any of you guys that have ever jumped off a high dive or otherwise, you've naturally had that moment where you've seen how you're going faster and faster until you hit the water. Now, we are going to do this when we're writing out our math problems without the effects of air resistance. So it's just, this is going to be what you're going. And yes, friction, all these things would go ahead and negatively affect this acceleration. So effectively it would naturally taper off and you'd hit a peak in real world, but we're not going to get that complicated. Instead, I just want you guys to understand the basics of how physics is supposed to work. Okay? Now, another big component to keep in mind is what's known as center of gravity. This is going to be the point of which in your body where all of the rest of your mass happens to be equally distributed. Okay? Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be inside of your body. This can be outside of your body, depending on how you're positioned. And it's going to change accordingly to whatever position you're in. So how you're built is going to influence your center of gravity. So if you're a total, bro from the wreck that, why train legs? No chick ever asks you how much you can squat or deadlift. And it doesn't even matter how much I bench. It just matters how much it looks like I can bench press. So their center of gravity is going to be higher because all their weight is up higher in their body. Meanwhile, if you guys have ever met somebody who's like a long distance cyclist or like an Olympic lifter, those folks can have a lot of muscle on their lower body and not a whole lot on the upper body. So their center of gravity is going to be lower. And based upon genetics, based upon your body composition, that's going to influence the center of gravity. And posture obviously is going to influence it. Now, when you're playing a sport, now let's say, for example, football, is it better to play the game with a low center of gravity or a high center of gravity? Yes, exactly. You're harder to tackle, and it's going to be much more easy for you to apply force to your opponent or otherwise. I'm sorry, I won't say the name, honestly, because I don't even know the kid's name, but I got to show you guys what I saw because it's freaking hilarious. Whenever over the summer we would go outside, myself and Dr. Sasha, we would go to some conditioning, and the football team, they showed up in July, and it was their red shirts and their new guys effectively came in, and I will always, it was amazing. One of their linemen. Okay, I don't know if this is going to work. Okay, so this is me standing upright. The coach was like, get in your three-point stance. This is literally what he did. And I know you can't tell, but I literally just put my middle finger on the ground. That's it. Didn't bend his legs whatsoever. His knees were bolt locked. And then the coach blew the whistle for him to sprint. And then, oh yeah, and then blows the whistle for him to sprint. He stands up. To which, I'm old. I don't want another brain injury. But damn, I wanted to line up against that kid because I'm sure I could have taken him down. Because real high center of gravity, and he was already 6 foot, probably 6. He's a very tall guy. So with that, it doesn't take much to get underneath him and push him back and over. In most sports, you really want to have a low center of gravity because you're going to have a greater amount of control. Zach, if you hearken back to good old yoga, how easy is it to hold that tree pose when you have both your hands overhead as opposed to whenever you have your hands down low?
Much harder.
Because we're making our center of gravity much higher, and because of that, it's much more difficult to stabilize. Where if we have that lower center of gravity, it's easier to hold our position. Okay? Now, modifying your center of gravity can be really useful when we're playing sports outside of having to overcome another individual. One of the best exploitations of this ever is what's known as the Fosbury flop, where previous to essentially his innovation, the way that people would high jump is effectively by jumping and then scissor kicking over the bar. In order to do that, your center of gravity has to get way above that bar in order to clear it. Whereas whenever you do that lean back flop position, notice that the center of gravity of these athletes can be lower than the actual height they're clearing. And so they actually don't have to get up as high in the air, and they're going to be able to cover those heights that they instead wouldn't have made it. Now, this is going to be basic Newtonian physics. First thing we want to talk about is when we have those two objects, they're going to always exert a slight gravitational force on one another, and you're always going to apply the force on one another in equal and opposite directions. You, as a resident of planet Earth, are constantly applying your force into the center of the planet. So hence, your butt on your chair, your feet on the floor, those are pulling down with the exact same amount of force that the Earth is pushing up on you, okay? This is where we come up with the basic idea: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So whenever I push down to the ground, really that just lifts me up, because it turns out I do not weigh near as much as the planet. And the same thing, whenever I push to the side, it's going to drive me sideways, because I'm not going to cause the Earth to rotate that direction. It's going to push me the other direction. So we think of this as what's known as ground reaction forces. So when we're working with athletes, we're obviously trying to probably have the highest possible ground reaction forces, because that's going to allow us to effectively stop faster, accelerate faster, and change direction faster. So when you're working with any of the kids that you happen to be training, what surface can you guys think of has really good ground reactive forces, meaning you push into it and it pushes back on you just as hard? Trampoline, that is an interesting way to go about it, because now you're using what's known as strain energy and converting potential energy and kinetic energy. That's good, but we'll come back to it. Yeah, a good rubberized track, concrete, yeah. When's the last time you ever landed on concrete and it really absorbed that force really well for you? Okay, now aside from obviously falling in a pool, what surface can you think of playing on that absorbs a lot of force? A mat, specifically if it's a really, thick one for gymnastics, absolutely. Turf, field turf, maybe, but think even more so, guys. If I told you you had to go run and essentially kind of flop onto this type of surface outdoors, what rephrase? If you had to go lay on something or fall onto something outside, what would you probably want it to be? Not bad. Not bad, Catherine. Grass definitely is one of them. Think even softer. Sand is definitely a great option there, Dominique. Think about when you guys are trying to accelerate in sand or stop in sand, how slow that is, how much it absorbs that force. Absolutely. And now think the opposite time of year to wanting to be on sand. Bingo, snow. How many of you guys ever played snow football growing up? Okay, that's the best because I was a fat kid, so I couldn't really change direction. So snow is great because the skinny kids couldn't change direction either. So I could actually get them. And then second of all is the fact that when you're landing in snow, that packs, that actually absorbs the force for you. Does it make sense? It's why you don't typically see people playing a pickup football game on asphalt. Does that make sense to you guys? So we're thinking about these surfaces. And now when you think through these surfaces, not just in the whole, like, I've got to land on it, but hey, if I've got to go run all those miles, go run, 2, 3, 5, 10 miles outside, and I want to not beat up my joints as much, I want to run on a softer surface. So that's where you'd want to go run on something like that rubberized track, grass, turf, nice, soft dirt trails. But if you want to go fast, that's where you want to be on the rubberized track, or you want to be on pavement, you want to be on concrete, you want to be on something that's firm, that's going to deliver that force back into your body. So the basics of the 3 Newtonian laws, feel free to go ahead and look at these links later, guys. It just kind of helps go. But it's just 3 basic ideas. One is which objects in motion tend to stay in motion and at rest tend to stay at rest unless acted upon. So you're going to just sit there until something or yourself moves you. And once you get moving, it's easy to stay moving. So, and I'm sorry to pick on Zach because I know he's done this before, but how painfully obvious is the first law of motion when you're having to do a heavy sled drag in competition?
It sucks.
That is a great way to say it. Very eloquent. Thank you, Zach. So once you get the sled moving, pretty much anyone that'll ever coach you in strongman says, do not stop. Because the second you stop, it's hard to get that sucker going again. So it's better to just keep taking the pain and keeping it moving than to think you're going to stop and get a breath. And so keep that in mind. And we're also going to talk about the interesting effects of static versus dynamic friction in a bit. Now, our force is always going to equal our mass times acceleration. Okay? So back to, I believe it was Catherine who unfortunately had her, the side of her face versus the ground and the ground won, right? Yes. Thank you for having a sense of humor about that. So the mass in that example is literally the mass of her body because that's what hit. So that was driven into her face, okay? She had the acceleration of gravity, so that 9.81 meters per second, and whatever velocity she was going, and Lord knows concrete, once again, doesn't absorb. So she's going at, however many meters per second, and then in a fraction of a second, she's going 0 miles an hour. So, or meters per second. So that force is gonna be pretty darn big. She's got the mass of her body behind it, and then a huge acceleration because she's going from blank to 0. And so that is how you break a bone. Does that make sense? Now, on the flip side, how many of you guys have seen the, and this is not something to watch if you happen to be someone that doesn't do well with watching catastrophic injuries. Did you guys see the video of the, I believe it was a Russian squatter in the past week or so that blew both of his knees, squatting like 900 pounds? Oh yeah, no, it's something to not watch before you got to do a leg day. It's going to talk you out of it. But effectively what happened to him is going to be that same basic idea, force equals mass times acceleration. It wasn't the acceleration that got him, it was the sheer mass, because he's probably got to be 250 plus pounds of a dude, and that was 900 freaking pounds. So when he had all of that weight going through the knee joints just for a fraction of a second, effectively the wrong way, and pop goes the weasel. So hence again, the mass and the acceleration are always going to be the 2 things that matter. Now, let's think about, any of you guys ever do judo, learn how to do like dive rolls and things like that? Nobody in the class has ever tried to do that before? Any of you guys, everyone in this class has been punched in the face at least once in their life, right? Okay, I mean, I'm just saying it's not a good thing to get punched in the face, but it's a good thing. I like the way of saying I'm familiar with that. That's a solid answer. I'm not saying violence is the answer and being sucker punched really hurts, but there's a difference between you can see the punch coming and you can try to go with it and roll with it and absorb it, and then you get punched in the ear from behind because someone sucker punched you and it just nails you with all that force at once because you can't absorb. Because if we take that force over a longer period of time, we essentially are going to decrease the acceleration effect. So we're actually going to have a lower amount of force that we're encountering. Does that make sense to you guys? Well, who am I kidding? We don't have to get violent. Think about jumping. If I had you guys, I want you to say jump off of, I'm in the classroom right now, like a chair and land and then absorb with your legs, with your ankles, your knees, and your hips. Or if I told you I want you to jump off the chair and I want you to land completely straight-legged. Yeah, I like how John's like, no, that sounds incredibly stupid. Why would anyone do that? But then watch people try and play sports on occasion and you see people already do that to themselves. And then they complain about joint pain because it's going to be the same mass, the same acceleration, but the acceleration is different. Because if you absorb for a longer period of time, it turns out that acceleration is going to be much lower than if you just land straight-legged, okay? And then finally, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when I'm pushing the ground to the right, it moves me to the left. When I push the ground to the left, it moves me to the right, and so on. Now, this breaks down and is pretty funny to watch when people try to walk on ice. Because when you try to push, really you just push your leg behind you, and if you push it too aggressively, you faceplant. So, force again, guys, is going to be that push or that pull that we're going to put that change of the state of motion in whatever object we're working with. And we're going to break it into vectors. So this is old school algebra, guys. This is going to be your X and Y axes, okay? So if we have a shot putter throwing that shot put, they're going to throw it in an upward angle. And as they do so, they're going to have a vertical force vector and they're going to have a horizontal force vector. Anything we do is always going to have this force vectoring, okay? So think about when someone is doing a squat. Hopefully all of their force is going where? Vertically or horizontally?
Vertical.
Bingo. Yeah, if you're going horizontal with a squat, things are probably not going well. You're either falling forward or you're falling backwards. Now, think about an athlete in the blocks at the beginning of the sprint, okay? They're applying the force, obviously horizontally because they're trying to go forward. But if they only apply that force horizontally and they don't apply any of the force vertically, they're literally just going to fall on their face. So you're always going to have a certain amount of force that's both vertical and horizontal with running, with throwing, with anything other than a straight up vertical jump or obviously a vertical movement that involves a barbell. Does that make sense to you guys? And so it's going to have a quantity, so how much force is going in each direction, and then the direction for it, okay? And this comes down to basic algebra, in that effectively what we're always going to form, if we've got our axes here, okay? Okay. Cool, okay, so we have our axes here. And let's say you throw that football at a 30-degree angle, okay? So you're going to naturally have two vectors here. You've got a vertical vector and you have that horizontal vector. So if with that 30 degrees, this was initially being thrown at say 10 meters per second, and this is now when we're starting to touch on things like trigonometry, where you're going to go ahead and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, guys. It's okay if you're a little confused right now. We're going to go through this a lot, but I just kind of want to introduce it. So if we're going to take the sine of 30 degrees, that's going to be about 0.5. So in theory, this is going to be about 5 meters per second, if I remember correctly. And then the other side is going to be, oh gosh, it'll be effectively the square root of 75. Which the square root of 75 is going to be like 8.66. Don't quote me. This thing just does math on its own. I don't understand it either. Okay, but do you understand how we're going to have the two separate vectors? And when we're talking about triangles, guys, remember that with a triangle, we're always going to have a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where this is going to be b, this is going to be a, and this is going to be c. Does that make sense? You're always going to move your vectors like that, so you're going to be able to figure out each of those parts. Good. So, when we're looking at motion, as a human, we naturally are going to have a combination of both linear and angular motion. So hence we're going to refer to that as general motion. Now, for you guys, when you stand up from sitting down is what I assume a lot of you guys are doing, you have linear movement. Which direction is that linear movement? Yes, Haley, it's gonna be vertical. You're standing up. Okay, now that's the global movement in your body. Now, can you guys tell me a joint where you are going to have angular movement? If you go from sitting down to standing up. The hips, yes, what else? Good. The knees, and then there'll probably be just a little bit at the ankles also. Make sense? Because the way that we move is going to be through rotation about axis, okay? So the only movement that you can really do as a human is angular, but when we combine all those angular movements together, we're going to get a linear movement. So when you're walking, you've got angular motion at your shoulders, at all of the joints in your legs, probably even a little bit of angular movement throughout your torso, through your spine, but you're getting linear movement in that you're walking. So let's talk a little bit about projectiles, which I enjoy because this is going to be something that can't move unless we give it some assistance, and this can be balls, people, and or javelins. As an ex-cheerleader, throwing people can be fun, but it is quite dangerous on occasion. So when an object is in motion through the air, it's going to have what's known as a trajectory. This is just the flight path. Now, any of you guys that have ever played baseball, softball, soccer, tennis, or you've ever done the recreational activity that is referred to as golf, you guys have seen trajectory before, where you can watch the object and spot it as it goes through the air. Sometimes it'll curve, and that's going to be due to effects that we're going to get to later, known as the Magnus effect, and effectively vortices that are going to form thanks to the rotation of the object. That's near the end of this class, guys. Don't worry about it. But it's important that we understand this basic trajectory. And that when we're looking at, in that basic physics, again, where we're kind of in a vacuum, we don't have wind resistance, we're going to look at the angle the object was released at, the velocity that it was released at, and the height of its release. All of that is going to influence how far that object's going to go. So, for example, if I was going to take any of you guys and have you guys throw a shot put, okay? how could I set up that shot put that nearly anybody in this class would probably be able to throw that shot put 30 plus feet? Horizontally. It's gone 30 feet horizontally. What would I need to do? Downhill is an option. I would say, and let's be honest, we'd have to really pick the direction well, or depending on what your guys' thoughts are on destroying property, we don't. We have you throw a shot put off the top of Commonwealth. It's got enough time to fall down that even if you barely had it having any horizontal velocity, it's still going to have a good 20 stories to come back down to the ground, so it's going to be able to cover some distance. Does that make sense to you guys? Now, we can't make it lighter. Come on, Catherine. That's soft. We'll throw the heavier shot put. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It'd be kind of neat to just drop one strongman stone off the top of that building and see what happens, but I don't want to go to those meetings. But if one of you guys did it and videoed it, no, you guys shouldn't do it. I'm recording this. That's a bad idea. Don't ever do that. Anyways, so if you're trying to make an object go further, the height of the release is going to be useful. Now, obviously, if I told you guys to throw a baseball, like you're trying to get the ball in from the outfield so that you can get out a runner, you're probably going to throw that ball as hard as you can. But how do you think angle of release is going to help?
Kind of where you want the ball to go.
No, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like now we're not just thinking about you're aiming it to go directly where you want, but the difference between if we arc it, it's going to have more time to go through the air effectively than if we throw it on a straight line, because now, since there's not as much vertical displacement, it's going to be coming back to the ground. Because the second we let go of the ball, it's under the mercy of gravity. So hence why you typically see if somebody makes a really like long throw in football, baseball, etc., they tend to release it at about like a 30-degree angle, because that's going to give us the greatest amount of loft while still maintaining enough of the horizontal velocity. Because in real world, the air resistance is going to slow you down. So throwing above 30 degrees with anything outside of like shot puts and javelins is not useful. However, when we're throwing something, when we go above 45 degrees, we actually have a greater amount of vertical velocity than with horizontal. So hence it's going to spend a lot of time in the air, but it's not going to go very far. Think of a pop-up in softball or baseball. And also, this is Kentucky. I'm sorry, I grew up in Missouri, not Missouri, and I'll go into why that is if you guys ever want in person. But I was never really around basketball growing up, so being here is kind of a stranger in a strange land. Why do you also want to make sure that you have a higher angle of release when you're trying to shoot a basket?
So it drops at the right time to go in.
Yeah, because the hoop isn't horizontal. You can't just go through it like it's a net. It's vertical, so you have to always loft the ball enough that it goes in. So hence, we're already doing these calculations in our mind when we're playing sports. In this class, we're just going to quantify it a bit more. That's all it is. So what we just talked about, the angle release is going to go ahead and affect how far it's going to go. If we throw it straight up in the air, it's not going to go as far. Any guys ever just shot an arrow straight in the air when you're a kid and just then try to panic and see where it went? No? Hey, it's okay. It's okay. Some people grew up in places that were great places to leave. I was one of them. That's okay. And we always want to make sure that that angle of release is optimal for what we're doing. So notice, guys, how much lower that angle of release is for a long jumper, because they want to maintain as much of that horizontal velocity as possible and effectively just get themselves enough loft that their inertia and momentum is going to carry them as far as possible. So when we're happening to be starting above ground and ending on the ground, we're typically going to make sure that we have an angle, like I said, somewhere in the 30-degree range. Now, when you go with more heavy objects, that's where you want to go even higher of an angle, because the wind resistance isn't going to be as big of a factor. But if you're throwing something like a baseball, or you're throwing something like a wiffle ball, you want to be careful you're not lofting too much, because you're going to lose so much from that wind resistance because of the loss of horizontal velocity, because now you're putting more into the vertical. So Velocity, remember guys, again, is going to be simply the velocity, or sorry, the distance over time. Height is where it's starting with. And so, wow, I guess we've already talked on all the wonderful practical applications of this one. And we want to now go ahead and really have some fun with math. And by have fun with math, I have fun with math, and hopefully you guys do too. Okay? So the first formula is going to be just simply horizontal distance. X, guys, is always going to be meters, so that's distance, equals V, which is velocity, times time. Now, notice we don't have an effect of acceleration. That's what comes into play with the actual full distance formula, and then also the velocity formula, where A is going to stand for acceleration. VO means the initial velocity. So for all the math you guys are going to do in this class, you always are going to assume that horizontal velocity, unless we say it's changing, isn't changing. And same thing whenever we're trying to figure out that horizontal distance. So let's just do a couple simple examples here. Quadratic formula is going to show up on occasion when we have to infer some things, but we'll build up to it. Okay, guys, we're not going straight into it. Now, if I have an object, let's say that's going at 10 meters per second, and it travels at 10 meters per second for 5 seconds, how far is it gone? You guys can throw it up in the chat, or you guys can go ahead and unmute yourself, your choice. What you guys coming up with? Yeah, no worries, Zach. If we have an object that's traveling along at 10 meters per second, it does so for 5 seconds, how far is it gone? Bingo, 50 meters. Thank you guys also for including your units. That's a big key. Always making sure we're maintaining those units. Okay, so same question. Object's going 10 meters per second, travels at that speed for 5 seconds. How fast is it going after 5 seconds? Starts at 10 meters per second, does that, travels at that speed for 5 seconds. How fast is it going at the end? Bingo. Because we haven't changed the velocity at all through acceleration. It's 10 meters per second. Good job, guys. Okay? When in doubt, just look at your formula. Like I said, I'm never going to make you guys memorize it. Keys, you have to understand how we plug these things in. Okay? So now we're going to make things a little bit more complicated. You see that distance formula, where y equals v sub o times time plus or minus 1/2 of the acceleration times time squared, and then minus, essentially that's the initial y. So if we were starting above the ground, it would be a plus. If we were under the ground or lower, it would be negative. That's something we can worry about. But for this example that I'm about to give you guys, don't worry about it. Okay? Same car. It's going, starting off at 10 meters per second. It's going to travel at that speed for 5 seconds. However, it's going to be accelerating at 2 meters per second for those 5 seconds. How fast is it going?
Be 75 meters.
Good job. Okay. So I was turned the other direction, so I have no idea who said that, but you were absolutely correct. Can you guys see what I wrote on this board? Okay, so we start off with our formula. Initial velocity times time, plus or minus 1/2 of the acceleration multiplied by time squared. Now, in this example, the car was accelerating, so it's going faster. So that means we're going to be plus sign, okay? Because we're adding to that velocity. So we have 10 times 5, because 10 multiplied by 5 seconds, plus 1/2 of the acceleration, which was 2, multiplied by time squared, so 5 to the second power. So then x equals 50 plus 25, 50 plus 25 is 75, and you've gone 75 meters in that period of time. Does that make sense to you guys? Because if it doesn't, that's okay, and we'll go through it. Okay, now let's go ahead and do another example, okay? Still the basic idea, we're working with acceleration, okay? We're gonna say it was going 10 meters per second, okay? It's gonna be doing this now instead of actually, let me do this to make life easy for you guys. Okay? We're gonna say the initial velocity equals 10. Time is gonna equal 10, but our acceleration is going to equal -4. Okay? So -4 meters per second. How fast or how far will it be? Ooh, yeah, we'll do both of those. Let's first go ahead and do how far will it have gone at the end of those 10 seconds? Whenever you guys come up with an answer, just go ahead and write, put it in the chat. It's okay to be wrong, guys. The goal is to learn. I don't think it was Epictetus, but I do like the line of you can't teach someone what they think they already know. Anybody have any ideas? Okay. So Luke and Cam have both put up their guesses. Luke, you're really close, but make sure you're remembering the acceleration is negative, so it's going to be slowing down, not going faster. Unfortunately, Haley, that is also off base. I don't know what you did there. The joys of not being able to see your guys' work, so I can't really figure out what's going on. And you guys can always put the vote up in the participant side if you want. How many of you guys agree with Cam's answer? Okay, good. We've got 3 people that are agreeing with Cam. And that's okay, Zach. That's okay. The funny thing is right now, there's about as many people talking as there normally is in biomechanics when class is actually in the room. I really don't like talking to myself. It feels weird. And it's even weirder when I see myself in the picture-in-picture and I realize that my hair is getting insane. So, okay, guys. It's okay. It's a lot. Now, so I've got the answer up here on the wall. Okay. Now, here's the big key. This is where, Luke, you had everything right, but then you just forgot to flip the signs because remember, the acceleration is negative. Okay. Haley, I don't know what you did there, but I appreciate you trying, and that's the big key. So we first start off by just setting it up. Initial velocity times time, blah, 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 blah. So our initial velocity is 10, and we do this for 10 seconds. Then we come over here. The acceleration, plus or minus, it's negative, because remember, we're going slower. Okay, we're deaccelerating. So 1/2 times 4, because that's going to be our acceleration, times 10 squared, because that's our time. Okay? The key is you have to write it out, guys, because calculators, if you don't plug them in correctly, they're going to mess up what's known as your order of operations. You guys might remember that, the good old PIMDAS. Oh, no, it's okay, Haley. It's all right. Guys, part of this is making a mistake. Remember, if you walk into this class and you get everything right the first time, why are you here? Let's save each other time. You just take all the stuff now and just pass my class and you can move on, okay? Most of you guys are here to learn. So the goal is that you guys learn, which means you're gonna make mistakes, and that's okay, all right? So we get 10 times 10 equals 100, minus, okay, 1/2 times 4 is 2, 10 times 10 is 100. So effectively we have 100 minus 200. So our final distance is actually gonna be negative 100. Because you can, the idea is the car is going forward and then it's slowing, and then at one point it's going to stop and then it's going to come backwards. And so if we let it go another 10 seconds, the car would be at a much greater negative value. It would be really going backwards at a really high speed. Does that make a bit more sense now, Zach? Okay. Hey, Cass, it's okay. Yes, that's why you get practice on this stuff. That's why we're going to go through and do a lot of examples. Okay. It's just weird because normally you guys are in the room and I can see the look of, but I can't see that right now. I can see Zach and John both like, So I'm like, okay, they're figuring it out, but you know, it's okay. It's normal to struggle. Okay, it's normal to struggle with the stuff. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing, only let's figure out how fast that object was actually going after those 10 seconds. So we come on back. Swear to God, I've got these fat fingers, so using the touchpad just doesn't work very well. Okay. Notice there, guys, we have our velocity formula of v, so that's the current velocity, equals the initial velocity plus or minus the acceleration times time. So in this example, if we're going to have v equals v sub o, so that's 10, minus, because it's a negative acceleration, 4 times 10. So 4 times 10 is 40. So we have 10 minus 40, which means our current velocity is going to be negative 30 meters per second. So if you want to think of like what would be a real world example of it, would be like if you were driving a car up a hill at, let's say that, 10 meters per second, and you just put it in neutral. It would keep going until eventually it would stop because of that negative acceleration, and then it would start going backwards and going faster and faster. That's effectively what we've got going on here. Because it's okay if it doesn't seem very intuitive to like, how would an object be going backwards at a negative acceleration and keep going backwards? And then to which I would simply say, how many of you guys have been walking down the street and encountered a danger noodle? Or as we like to call it anywhere else, a snake. And then all of a sudden found yourself backpedaling faster and faster to get away from that object. Same thing might happen around crazy X's or otherwise. I don't know. I don't know your lives. Okay? So, questions with the formulas we did here. Otherwise, I think we will all agree that this is a pretty solid dose of application of information that you guys haven't had before. So we can call it here, and I feel pretty good about that for the day. Now, the other thing that I'm just gonna introduce, we're not gonna touch on, which is that trigonometry. If you aren't familiar with it, this is the old school SOHCAHTOA. So the sine of the angle equals the opposite side of the triangle over the hypotenuse of the triangle. This is how we're going to take that initial velocity at a specific angle and figure out then the horizontal velocity and then what's the vertical velocity. Sorry, someone was trying to call my laptop while I'm teaching. Screened. Now, the other thing I want you guys to understand, and this is going to be up in the documents for the class, download this and make sure that you have it on your computer, especially when you take any of the quizzes, meaning not you could use it for the homework quizzes, but it won't be as useful, but the actual quizzes you guys are going to have to take. Right here, we just went through those 4 formulas today, and I introduced to you guys the basics of the trig. This is all of the formulas you're going to end the quadratic equation. These are all the formulas you're going to use over the entire semester. Okay? They're all here. You don't have to memorize them. You will always, well, you're going to be taking these at home. So I just suggest if you want, you can print it off and even fill in things so you know what it is. Or you can just go ahead and just kind of have it in the background. You can click over to it so you can go back and forth. I don't know your guys' life. So, but this is the cheat sheet that whenever I teach this in person, I literally put it up on the projector whenever people are taking quizzes or exams. So they always have that to go off of. Okay? But that'll be under equation slide, and obviously it's the end of the chapter 2 notes. And speaking of which, you guys in theory have your individual quiz and your group quiz. If you don't have a group yet, you guys need to email me that group and get on it. I haven't checked my email yet today, so maybe you already did it. If you did, thank you. I'm sorry if I feel like you're getting yelled at. Those of you that already have your groups, take your quiz as an individual, then contact your group and figure out if there's a time that works for all of you. If there's a time that only works for some of you guys and you just kind of take it together over the phone or whatever method you guys can meet up online, I am old. I'm sure there is a number of methods that you guys can talk with each other online other than, FaceTime, Google Chat. I'm running out of gas really fast, but something. And that way you guys are going to be able to take it as a group together and make sure that you guys are kind of helping each other out. Now remember, the quiz this week is only over the chapter 1s in both books. it's not over what we really went into for the second half of the lecture today. But make sure you get it done before the end of the day. Yes, Catherine.
It's kind of about that. So do we all take the group quiz?
Yes.
Okay.
You're all going to take the group quiz. Now, if there's a situation where you guys are like one person has it up and then the rest of you guys, once again, I don't know your life, email me that say like, you know, just because I can see it, you know, myself and then Cass and Jared, like we took it together, but only Cass took the exam. So we should have the exact same grade that she got. Does that make sense? And when you do send me that email, CC their names on it, because I'm not saying people are going to cheat, but I am going to say that somebody might try. Be like, yeah, I get the same grade as the real smart kid in the class. You and I are in the same group. Don't ask them about it though. Just give me the same grade. So, but I trust you guys. I want to make sure you guys do well. So, does that answer your question, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So sorry for going over, guys. You guys have a great day. Stay safe out there, and I will see you guys on Tuesday morning. Okay? Bye-bye.